Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we're almost done with at least everything that there exists as far as I'm aware of the 500 Kingdoms. There will be one more after this. And the Sleeping Beauty is an interesting one, partly, of course, in other books in this series, Mercedes Lackey has reached into, folk tales / fairy tales that come from outside of the very strictly Western tradition. But in this one, she pulls the lead character out of the ring cycle, the Siegfried, from the ring cycle, and pulls him directly into the story of a princess, Rosamund, and this is called The Sleeping Beauty. But what's interesting in this is the princess of this kingdom finds herself in a position where, in effect, the fairy godmother discovers that this young woman could manage to pull off being either Sleeping Beauty or Snow White. And the fairy godmother decides, among other things, to try to push both narratives simultaneously at the tradition, figuring that the more narrative threads she throws at the tradition, the less likely it is to force them onto any one path, because it's going to be confused. It's going to look at things and say, well, she could do this, but she could also do this other thing, but also this other thing. Oh no, how do I pick? And it's one of the classic, it strikes one as probably being a classic or very useful thing that a fairy godmother could do in this universe, where you have this force that tries to mold everybody into recognizable stories, is to set up as many different stories, potential stories as possible, existing together simultaneously, thus putting the tradition in a position of not being able to tell which story, and thus it doesn't push anyone down any particular path because it doesn't know what path to pick. The ring cycle thing in this kicks in because Siegfried, who is supposed to pick up a ring and fall in love with his aunt and a whole bunch of tragedy stuff. I've never actually bothered to read a summary of the ring cycle, and I've never liked opera, so Wagner's particular Gesamtkunstwerk there, which is apparently 800,000 hours long, is just not a thing that I've ever really, bothered with, even though I really should. But anyways, this posits a Siegfried who is smart enough to listen to talking animals, and when the talking animals tell him, you really shouldn't do that, because if you do that, you're going to immediately find yourself on a path to ultimate doom, death, and destruction, he listens. And he winds up with a sort of a bird sidekick who basically scouts for him, who warns him when he's about to do stuff, and who explains the tradition to him, specifically in terms, of course, of where he's from, which is a very sort of Norse place, very Scandinavian one, with, a lot of emphasis, as I said, on the ring cycle and melodramatic Viking gods who, like gods in most pantheons, don't have any sense at all. Because that is one of the things about people's pantheons of gods, is that gods tend to be very, very human, in terms of being shallow and self-centered and a whole bunch of other stuff, because it makes their motivations so much more understandable and empathetic to people, and if the gods are morons, well, then it means you don't have to feel as bad about being a moron. Anyways, so you have this wonderful bit, because what Siegfried has been trying to do is, because his sort of, predicted future is he's supposed to find a woman asleep in a ring of fire and wake her up with a kiss. he's endlessly looking to find a young woman asleep in a ring of fire who is not a family member, so he will not fall in love with his aunt. And, you know, so he stumbles into this story when Rosalind, who has been put to sleep for the purposes of, among other things, of helping her escape the 7 not evil, just selfish and extremely, well, not very hygienic dwarves that picked her up. The thing is that, of course, because the tradition with Snow White is that the dwarves rescue her and, you know, take care of her and so on, it means that the dwarves can't hurt her, but because they're just terrible people and not very hygienic, they chain her up in their cottage and say, okay, you're going to cook and clean for us, and she sort of does a minimal amount where she's like, yes, I will throw all of this into a giant pot of boiling water because everything is so gross that frankly even that will be an improvement. So you have that, but anyway, she still has to be gotten out of this, so her fairy godmother bails her out by impersonating the wicked witch who poisons Snow White with an apple and then getting her out of it, waking her up later. Except, of course, part of the process of waking her up with magic involves a ring of fire, and so Siegfried sees Princess asleep in ring of fire and is like, oh my god, this is not my aunt, this is perfect, this will allow me to escape my doom. Because that's sort of really, really central to him, because he is more than willing to kiss a woman who may not have wanted him to kiss her when she's awake if it will allow him to avoid a horrific death. You know, it's the kind of thing where in the modern idiom we might say, well, you know, there's sexual assaulting, but I have to tell you, I could probably find it in my heart to forgive somebody who wakes me up from, you know, an enchanted sleep, because if he does so, he will avoid dying horribly. It just sort of seems like, you know, common decency. And then at the same time, another prince who got booted out of his own country because he was too popular, that basically he's a second son, and he's a very nice guy, and he, you know, works very hard, and he's the kind of person who would make a terrible king, but he would try. You know, but he's not meant to be a king. He's meant to go out and have fun, and he puts his, you know, and he helps people, and he's more of, you know, sort of a genial adventurer type and a bit of a scoundrel, but basically a nice guy seeking his fortune. But, you know, he also saw a princess that was asleep and is thinking, well, here's my ticket. I kiss the princess, wake her up, and, you know, we marry, and yay, we're all done. And he and Siegfried get into a tussle, which gives the fairy godmother the time she needs to wake Rosamund up with magic, and, like, following this, she creates a whole series of trials that are in the idiom of the trials that you would expect in a fairy tale. But the whole reason for this series of trials to win the hand of the princess is actually, strategically, the great tradition of political, hostages. And political hostages are, of course, a long historical tradition. That's something people have done forever. You can find it all throughout history of noble families, of kings who will say, we will host your children at our castle and they will get a first-class education. And all the nobility knows that what they're saying is, you will send us your children and we will hold them hostage against your good behavior, and if you rebel against us, we will murder all of your heirs. And then where will you be? So she sets this up basically to get political hostages, and of course, you know, a whole bunch of princes and adventurers and whatnot show up with the intention of saying, you know, if we win this trial, then we win the hand of the princess, and we get, and you know, and you get to be king. So you get a lot of people who are willing to show up because, frankly, sending one prince or, one second son out to a kingdom to do a bunch of trials when a princess's hand is a great deal less expensive than going to war. Now, everybody wants to invade this country because they've got, all the gold mines ever. They are incredibly wealthy, very tiny, and they've basically spent literally centuries fending people off. And so when the king abruptly dies, it puts them in an unfortunate position of a tremendous amount of vulnerability and no solution. So this particular book is a delight, not least of which because there's a lot of unending hijinks in it. That, you have Siegfried and the other prince whose name escapes me for the moment, and they have, sort of like a buddy thing going where they both agree to work together to get through the bulk of the trials, because up until you get to the last stage of the trials, you might as well help each other get through them. And so you have their friendship, which is a lot of fun because they're very, very different people, but they're both good people. So they get along fairly well, but because Siegfried is, very, very wilderness savvy, he's uncomfortable in cities, whereas the other prince, whose name still escapes me, is very, very comfortable in cities, whereas he looks at the woods ads. There's lions and tigers and bears, and I can't see them coming. This is the worst. Why are we here, Siegfried? So those two are a lot of fun. Rosamund, the princess, is a delight because, of course, the thing is that, first of all, her mother is one of the, the traditions of princesses, of young women who become queens, who started off lives as goose girls or, whatever. Her mother was, in fact, a young shepherdess who wound up marrying the king. And the thing is about that given the nature of how the tradition works, this godmother has actually had to inform and teach their royal family about the tradition. And so one of the things that they do in raising their children, in this case Rosamund, is they raise her to have the skill sets she will need dependent on any sort of various potential fairy tale plot lines, so that she knew how to do the work of a servant. I mean, she was shocked to discover that it was much harder to actually do the work of a servant than to learn how to functionally do it. Like, we all know how to mop a floor, but there's a difference between knowing how to mop a floor and having to get up and actually hardcore mop floor day after day after day. It's very different things. She is a princess, but she does learn how to mop the floor so that if she has to, she can. So there's a sort of a very pragmatic, effort that they wind up sort of dealing with things by talking through how to maneuver the tradition for stuff. And you wind up having two major romances because the godmother in this does indeed get a romance, which is, particularly interesting given who her romantic partner is, because her romantic partner is the face in the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all. That face is an actual person who, by the end of this novel, climbs out of the mirror, and he and the godmother get together, and it's very, very sweet. So this one may be my favorite in the series. There are some cross references here to other parts in the series, but this one is even more of a standalone than some of the others. And I'm running low on my self-designated time, so that's everything that I'm going to say on this one, and I will see you all next week.